Key West 911.
Yes, hello. I just shot
Okay.
someone in a
You just
parking
shot
lot.
someone? Okay. Why'd you shoot him?
He came at me aggressively in my parking lot.
His name was Garrett Hughes. He was 21 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He liked to laugh. He liked the ocean. He was the kind of young man who still called his mother just to check in. On the night of his death, Garrett was not robbing anyone. He was not threatening anyone. He was not carrying a weapon. He was standing in a parking lot in Key West, Florida, one of the most beautiful places in America, when a bullet ended everything. The man who fired that bullet was 57 years old. He owned property. He owned a business. He had a concealed carry permit and a loaded firearm. And when police asked him why he pulled the trigger, his answer was something no one expected. Something that would not hold up in a courtroom. Something that would not hold up under cross-examination. Something that witnesses standing just feet away would completely contradict. This is the story of a confrontation that never had to happen, a decision made in anger, a young life taken in seconds, and a trial that forced an entire community to ask one very difficult question. When does self-defense end, and when does murder begin? Key West is one of those places that exists in a permanent state of celebration. It sits at the very southern tip of Florida, a small island dangling at the end of a chain of keys surrounded by warm turquoise water on all sides. Tourists come from everywhere. They come for the sunsets at Mallory Square. They come for the fresh seafood and the cold drinks. They come for the bars on Duval Street, which never seem to close, where the music spills out onto the sidewalk and strangers become friends before midnight. On a typical evening in Key West, the air is thick and warm even after dark. The streets are busy. People are loosened up by vacation, by rum, by the feeling that being this far south, this close to the water, somehow puts normal rules on pause. Garrett Hughes was in town that night. He was 21, barely old enough to drink legally. He was at that age where everything still feels like an adventure. A Friday night in Key West with friends, music somewhere in the distance, the smell of the ocean never more than a few blocks away. Nearby, a building sat anchored in the middle of all that Key West energy. It was a commercial property. It had a bar on the ground floor, the kind of place that does solid business on a tourist island with a reputation for nightlife. Preston Lloyd Brewer III owned that building. He was 57 years old, a property owner, a businessman, the kind of man who had spent decades building something, accumulating assets, collecting the kind of pride that comes from ownership. He was also armed that night. He had a concealed carry permit for the state of Florida. He had a firearm on his person, and he was keeping an eye on his property, the way some men do when they feel the world is always one incident away from disrespecting what they have built. The night was still young. The bar was still open. The streets of Key West were still loud and alive. But somewhere between the laughter and the neon lights and the warm island air, something was about to go very wrong. It started with something small. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened next. It was not a robbery. It was not a territorial dispute between rival gangs. It was not a drug deal gone wrong or a confrontation that had been building for months. It was a young man urinating in a parking lot. Public urination, the kind of thing that happens in any city, in any tourist destination, on any weekend night, when the bars are full and the lines for the bathrooms are long. The kind of thing that gets a noise complaint, maybe a fine, a stern word from a police officer. Not a death sentence. Garrett Hughes was seen urinating near the parking lot adjacent to Preston Brewer's building. It is impossible to know exactly what Brewer felt in that moment. Maybe it was genuine offense. Maybe it was the accumulated frustration of a property owner who had seen too many drunk tourists treat his space like their personal bathroom. Maybe it was something else entirely. A feeling of authority, of ownership, a belief that he had the right to confront anyone on property he considered his. Whatever the internal calculation was, Brewer made a decision. He did not call the police. He did not instruct a bartender or a staff member to handle it. He did not simply wait for the young man to finish and walk away. Preston Brewer III walked out of that building, stepped into that parking lot, and decided to personally confront Garrett Hughes himself. He was armed. He was angry. And that is the moment, that specific moment, where a 21-year-old's life entered its final minutes. Every confrontation has a point of no return. A place where the road forks and one path leads home and the other path leads to catastrophe. Brewer chose the wrong path. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Seconds. That is all it takes. That is what people never understand until they are standing in a parking lot at midnight and someone is dead on the ground. The exact chain of physical events would later become the central battlefield of the entire legal case. Preston Brewer confronted Garrett Hughes. Words were exchanged, voices were raised. The confrontation escalated rapidly the way confrontations do when one person is armed and the other is young, and the night is hot and neither is willing to back down. What the witnesses saw, and what witnesses would later testify to under oath, was a man who came out ready to fight. A man who was the aggressor from the first moment he stepped into that parking lot. What Brewer would claim, what he would tell police, what he would maintain through every stage of the investigation was that Garrett Hughes attacked him, that he was the one in danger, that he had no choice, that this was self-defense. The gun came out. One shot fired. Garrett Hughes was hit. He collapsed in the parking lot of a Key West bar at approximately midnight, bleeding from a gunshot wound that would prove fatal. He never had a weapon. He never posed the kind of threat that justifies deadly force. He was 21 years old and he was dying in a parking lot over a confrontation that never should have started. The sound of the gunshot split the Key West night in two, everything that came before it and everything that came after. Brewer was still standing. Hughes was not. And somewhere nearby, someone was already reaching for a phone. The parking lot did not stay quiet for long. People moved. Voices rose. Someone screamed. The sound of a gunshot in a densely populated tourist area on a Friday night does not go unnoticed. Emergency services were called. The response was fast. Key West is a small island. Distances are short, but so is the time window between a gunshot wound and the point of no return. Garrett Hughes was transported to the hospital. He did not survive. He was pronounced dead, 21 years old, a young man who had walked into a parking lot just minutes before alive and loud and full of whatever a 21-year-old carries with them on a Friday night in Key West. Now he was gone. Preston Brewer III did not flee the scene. That is worth noting. He stayed. He was present when police arrived, but staying and cooperating that are two different things. The Key West Police Department responded quickly. Officers secured the scene, began separating, witnesses started gathering accounts. And immediately something became clear. The versions of events they were hearing did not match. The man who fired the gun had one story. The people who had been standing in or near that parking lot, the ones who had seen everything, had another. The gap between those two stories was not small. It was not a matter of perspective or memory. It was the difference between justified self-defense and first-degree murder. In the hours that followed, investigators began pulling surveillance footage from nearby cameras. Key West is a tourist destination. There are cameras everywhere on businesses on street corners monitoring parking areas. Whatever happened in that parking lot had almost certainly been recorded. The footage would either corroborate Brewer's story or destroy it. And somewhere in the chaos of that night, as statements were being taken and the parking lot was being treated as a crime scene, Preston Brewer was about to sit down across from a homicide detective. That conversation would change everything. There is something particular about the way a person carries themselves in a police interrogation room. Homicide detectives are trained to watch for it. They watch the hands. They watch the eyes. They watch the speed of the blink, the way someone breathes between sentences, the moments when a person speaks freely, and the moments when the words come out too carefully, too constructed, too prepared. Preston Brewer sat in that room as a man who believed he had a story that would hold. He was 57 years old. He had lived more than 5 decades. He had run a business, owned property, navigated the complications of adult life. He was not an inexperienced young man who would crack under the first hard question. But homicide detectives are patient. They do not need you to confess immediately. They need you to talk. The more you talk, the more you commit to a version of events. And the more you commit, the harder it becomes to adjust when the evidence contradicts you. The detective who sat across from Brewer that night was methodical. The question started soft. Basic timeline. Where were you? What did you see? What happened when you went outside? Brewer answered. He explained the urination. He explained his decision to confront Hughes. He explained in his version how the confrontation turned physical, how Hughes came at him, how he feared for his safety, how he had no choice. The word self-defense came up quickly. It always does in these situations. Florida has a complicated relationship with self-defense law. The state's Stand Your Ground statute has been at the center of some of the most controversial legal debates in American history. Brewer knew the language, he used it, but the detective was not finished. The detective had witnesses. The detective had surveillance footage. The detective had a crime scene and a dead 21-year-old in a community that was watching. And somewhere in the back and forth of that interrogation room, Preston Brewer's story started to develop cracks. Brewer's core claim was consistent. He never wavered from it. He said Garrett Hughes attacked him. He said he felt his life was in danger. He said the gun was a last resort after the situation escalated beyond his control. He said any reasonable person in his position would have done the same thing. He said it was self-defense. He kept saying it. What he did not say, what he could not quite explain in a way that satisfied the detective sitting across from him, was why. Why he had escalated the situation himself. Why he had chosen to personally confront a young man over a minor public nuisance rather than simply calling police. Why someone who genuinely feared for their safety would initiate a face-to-face confrontation in a dark parking lot while carrying a firearm. There are things people reveal when they talk under pressure that they never intend to reveal. Sometimes it is the specific detail they leave out, the gap in the narrative where common sense says something should be. Sometimes it is the way they describe the other person, the words they use, whether they express any remorse, whether the absence of remorse is itself meaningful. Brewer was consistent, but consistent is not the same as credible. The detective had already heard from witnesses before entering that room. Multiple people had been in or near that parking lot. Multiple people had seen the confrontation from its beginning, not just its end. And what those witnesses described was not a frightened man defending himself from an unprovoked assault. They described someone who came out angry, someone who initiated the confrontation and controlled its pace, someone who drew a weapon before the situation justified it. Brewer did not know exactly what the witnesses had said. He knew there were witnesses. He knew they had spoken to police, but he could not unsay the things he had already said, and he could not undo the things he had already done. His version of the night was locked in now, written down, recorded, and the evidence was about to start closing in from every direction. A homicide investigation in the modern era is less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about accumulation. Evidence builds on evidence. One confirmed fact leads to the next. The case does not collapse under a single revelation. It tightens slowly and inevitably, like a knot being pulled from both ends. The Key West Police Department had several significant assets in this investigation. The first was witness testimony. Multiple independent witnesses had been present. They were consistent with each other and fundamentally inconsistent with Brewer's account. They described Brewer as the aggressor, the one who came out hot, who controlled the pace of the confrontation, who drew the weapon first without sufficient provocation. Witnesses who do not know each other and arrive at the same account independently are a powerful form of evidence. They are difficult to dismiss, difficult to discredit. The second was surveillance footage. Key West Business District is monitored extensively, particularly in the high-traffic areas around Duval Street and the surrounding blocks. Cameras mounted on commercial buildings, on ATMs, at parking lot entrances, they record constantly indifferently, without any stake in what they capture. The footage from that night showed what happened. It corroborated the witnesses. It did not corroborate Preston Brewer. The third was the forensic evidence from the scene itself, the position of the body, the trajectory of the shot, the distance between the two men when the gun was fired. Physical evidence does not argue. It does not have a version of events. It exists outside the narratives people construct after the fact. The forensic picture that emerged was consistent with a shooter who was not in the kind of immediate physical danger that justifies lethal force. Brewer was charged. The charge was not manslaughter. It was not second-degree murder. It was not a charge that implied ambiguity about what happened or uncertainty about intent. Preston Lloyd Brewer III was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution was sending a message with that charge. They were saying, we do not believe this was a heat-of-the-moment act. We believe this was an act of deliberate, unjustified lethal violence. The message was noted. The case was going to trial, and the trial was going to force a jury to look at everything. Trials are slow. They are methodical and exhausting and procedural in ways that television dramas never quite capture. There are motions and continuances and arguments about what evidence is admissible and what the jury is allowed to hear. There are depositions and pretrial hearings and days when nothing seems to move. But eventually the jury sees everything. They heard from the witnesses who had been standing in that parking lot. They heard the accounts of what Brewer looked like before the gun came out. They heard descriptions of his demeanor, the aggression, the anger, the sense of a man who was not afraid but furious. They saw the surveillance footage. They heard from forensic experts who explained the physical evidence and what it told them about the position of the two men and the nature of the shooting. They heard Preston Brewer's account, his claim of self-defense, his insistence that he had no choice. And they weighed it all. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, not manslaughter, not second-degree, first-degree. In Florida, a first-degree murder conviction carries mandatory sentencing guidelines that leave very little room for discretion. The judge in this case sentenced Preston Lloyd Brewer III to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No early release, no possibility of parole board hearings down the road, no chance of walking out of a correctional facility after serving a portion of the sentence. Life without parole. Brewer was 57 years old when he was sentenced. The arithmetic is unforgiving. He came into that courtroom as a business owner, a property owner, a man with assets and a history and a life built over more than 5 decades. He walked out of it in handcuffs on his way to spend the rest of that life in a Florida state prison for firing one bullet in a parking lot over a confrontation he chose to initiate, over something that never had to happen. Body camera footage and interrogation recordings do something that court transcripts cannot. They give you the person, not just the words. When investigators and behavioral analysts study the footage from Preston Brewer's interrogation, certain patterns emerge that speak to something deeper than the facts of the case. They speak to the internal logic that Brewer was operating under, a logic that felt entirely coherent to him, even as it was collapsing under the weight of evidence. The first pattern is what psychologists call the self-justification loop. In the interrogation, Brewer was not primarily focused on explaining what happened. He was focused on justifying what he did. These are different cognitive processes. Explaining requires you to reconstruct events as they occurred. Justifying requires you to construct a framework that makes your actions defensible. The self-justification loop is especially common in people who used force and genuinely believe they were right to use it. They are not lying in the conventional sense. They are not coldly fabricating a story from scratch. They have already told themselves a version of events in which they were the threatened party, and they have told it enough times that it has taken on the weight of memory. This is particularly dangerous in gun violence cases because it means the shooter may have very limited insight into how their own aggression escalated the situation. Brewer appeared to have very limited insight. He did not seem to grasp or did not want to grasp the significance of the choice he had made when he decided to personally confront Garrett Hughes instead of calling police. In his framing, that choice was unremarkable. It was what any property owner would do. It was reasonable. The investigator pressed on this, gently but persistently. Why not call police? Why handle it yourself? You were armed. Didn't that make the confrontation more dangerous? Not less. Brewer's answers to these questions were defensive but revealing. He spoke about his right to control his property. He used language that suggested he viewed the parking lot as an extension of his authority, a space where he had not just the right, but the obligation to enforce order personally. Criminologists who study this pattern refer to it as the proprietary aggression model. It describes the behavior of individuals, often older men with assets or status, who interpret threats to their property or their sense of territorial control as personal threats to their dignity and authority. In the proprietary aggression model, the emotional calculus is distorted. A minor violation urination in a parking lot is experienced not as a nuisance, but as a direct challenge to who you are. And the response is disproportionate because the perceived offense was never really about the parking lot. It was about something else: pride, control, the feeling that your authority has been disrespected and that disrespect must be answered. There is another pattern worth noting in the interrogation footage. It is the absence of something. In interrogations involving accidental or genuinely defensive shootings, investigators often observe a specific emotional register in the shooter, a kind of traumatized disbelief. I cannot believe this happened. I keep seeing it. I wish I could take it back. This is not performance. It is the neurological signature of a person whose nervous system has been shocked by an outcome they did not consciously intend. That register was largely absent from Brewer's interrogation. He was composed. He was strategic. He was focused on the legal framing of his position. Those are not inherently signs of guilt. People respond to trauma differently. Composure under pressure does not equal callousness. The absence of visible distress is not evidence in itself. But behavioral analysts who review the footage note that the emotional content of Brewer's account skewed heavily toward the defense of his own actions, rather than toward any expression of grief or disorientation at the fact that a young man was dead. Garrett Hughes was 21 years old. He was dead. And in the interrogation room, Brewer spent very little time acknowledging that. The jury saw all of this, not just the words, the person. And the jury made its decision. This part is not about the trial. It is not about Preston Brewer or the legal process or the evidence or the verdict. This part is about Garrett Hughes. Because in cases like this, the victim has a tendency to disappear. They become the body in the parking lot, the reason for the investigation, the name on the charge sheet, a demographic detail, 21 years old male, Key West, Florida. They become a fact rather than a person. Garrett Hughes was not a fact. He was 21 years old, which means he was at the beginning of his adult life in the most literal sense. He had probably only recently been allowed into the bars he was visiting. He was at that age where independence is brand new and still thrilling, where you are old enough to make your own decisions, but young enough that everything still feels like possibility. He was somebody's child. He was somebody's friend. He was the person in some group of people who made everyone else laugh a little harder, or who texted to check in when you had not been around in a while, or who you could count on for something small and reliable and warm. These are the things we rarely hear about in true crime. The specific, undramatic texture of a person's life. The stuff that doesn't fit into a documentary narrative, but that is actually the most important part. Garrett Hughes went to Key West on a night that was supposed to be just another Friday. The kind of Friday you forget about a month later because nothing particularly significant happened. He encountered a man who was angry and armed. He did not have a weapon. He was not a criminal. He was not a threat. He was a 21-year-old in a parking lot, and then he was gone. The people who loved Garrett Hughes carry a specific kind of grief, the kind that comes with a particular cruelty, because his death was not inevitable. It was not an accident or an illness or the terrible lottery of genetics. It was a choice. Someone chose to walk out of a building and start a confrontation. Someone chose to escalate. Someone chose to pull out a gun. Someone made every decision in that chain of decisions that ended with Garrett Hughes dying in a hospital in Key West. That knowledge that it could have been prevented, that it was prevented until the moment someone decided not to prevent it, that is what follows the people who loved him. There is no way to wrap grief like that in something clean or hopeful. There is only the absence, the permanent, unchanged, non-negotiable absence of a 21-year-old who should still be here. His name was Garrett Hughes, and he deserved better. He deserved to make it home. Every case like this carries a lesson, usually more than one. Some lessons are specific to the law. Some are specific to culture. Some are specific to the particular alchemy of circumstances that produced a given tragedy. The Brewer case carries several lessons that are worth sitting with. The first is about the relationship between firearms and conflict escalation. Florida has one of the most permissive concealed carry environments in the United States. The right to carry a loaded firearm in public on your person is exercised by hundreds of thousands of Floridians every day. The vast majority of those people never fire their weapon. The vast majority of licensed carriers are responsible individuals who understand that a firearm is a tool of last resort and should remain holstered through every interaction that does not rise to the level of an imminent lethal threat. But the existence of a firearm changes the emotional architecture of any confrontation it enters. Preston Brewer did not decide to confront Garrett Hughes and then pick up a gun on the way out. He was already armed when he made the decision to step outside. The gun was already part of his self-concept in that moment, part of his authority, part of the reason he felt he had the right and the capability to personally manage the situation rather than calling the police. Research on gun violence consistently shows that the presence of a firearm in a confrontational encounter dramatically increases the probability of a fatal outcome. Not because guns fire themselves, but because armed individuals are statistically more likely to escalate confrontations, more likely to interpret ambiguous behaviors as threats, and more likely to cross the threshold to lethal force than unarmed individuals in identical situations. The gun did not cause the confrontation, but it made the confrontation possible in its most dangerous form. The second lesson is about what self-defense actually means. Self-defense law in the United States, and particularly in Florida, has been shaped by decades of legislation and case law into something genuinely complicated. But at its core, the concept is straightforward. Self-defense allows you to use force to protect yourself from an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death. It does not allow you to initiate a confrontation and then claim self-defense when that confrontation turns dangerous. It does not allow you to create the circumstances of your own threat and then shoot your way out of them. There is a legal doctrine present in Florida law and in the law of most states called the initial aggressor rule. Under this doctrine, a person who starts a fight or who voluntarily enters and escalates a confrontation cannot then claim self-defense without first making a genuine and effective attempt to withdraw from that confrontation. The jury in the Brewer case applied this doctrine. They found that Brewer was the initial aggressor. He chose to confront Hughes. He escalated the confrontation. The danger he found himself in was at least in significant part danger he had created. That is not self-defense. That is something else entirely. The third lesson is about the cost of pride. Of all the things that led to Garrett Hughes' death, the most preventable, the most obviously preventable was Preston Brewer's decision to personally handle the situation himself. He had a phone. He could have called the police and reported a noise complaint. He could have had a staff member address the situation. He could have done nothing and accepted that a tourist had momentarily treated his parking lot with less respect than he deserved. None of those choices felt satisfying in the moment. None of them gave Brewer the direct personal assertion of his authority over his own property. But all of them would have meant that Garrett Hughes walked home that night. And all of them would have meant that Preston Brewer did not spend the rest of his life in a Florida state prison. Pride has a cost. Ego has a cost. Sometimes the cost is measured in years. Sometimes it is measured in lives. The fourth lesson, the hardest one, is about who bears the consequences of that cost unevenly. Garrett Hughes did not start the confrontation. He had no say in whether that night escalated or de-escalated. He had no control over the decision that sent a bullet in his direction. He was acted upon not acting. And yet he is the one who did not come home. The 21-year-old in the parking lot, the one without a weapon, without any prior history of serious violence, without any conceivable justification for being shot, he is the one who paid with everything. The person who initiated the confrontation, who controlled its pace, who drew the weapon, he is the one still breathing, still able to receive visits, still able to wake up in the morning. That asymmetry is not justice. It is just what happened in the time before justice could intervene. And the people who love Garrett Hughes have to live with that asymmetry for the rest of their lives. Key West still looks the same. The sunsets at Mallory Square still draw crowds every evening. The bars on Duval Street still spill music onto the sidewalk. The ocean is still warm and close, and the kind of blue that makes people forget their ordinary lives back home. The parking lot where Garrett Hughes was shot is still there. Preston Lloyd Brewer III is serving a life sentence in a Florida State Correctional Facility. He will almost certainly die there. He was 57 years old when he was sentenced. The mathematics of a life sentence are simple and final. His building is still there. His bar presumably still operates. The business continues without him because businesses are not people. They do not grieve. They do not feel the absence. They simply continue. Garrett Hughes cannot continue. That is the part of this story that does not resolve, that does not find its way to a satisfying conclusion that gives the narrative a clean ending. There is no ending that brings him back. There is a verdict. There is a sentence. There is a man behind bars who will spend decades answering for what he did. In a legal and philosophical sense, justice was served. But justice served and justice done are not always the same thing. Every time a case like this surfaces, and cases like this surface constantly in parking lots and gas stations and driveways and sidewalks all across America, the same question presents itself. What would it have taken to stop this? What would it have created? In the Brewer case, the answer is humbling in its simplicity. It would have cost nothing. A phone call to police would have cost nothing. Choosing not to initiate a confrontation would have cost nothing. Accepting the minor meaningless indignity of a stranger urinating near a parking lot and letting it go would have cost nothing. Garrett Hughes would have walked home. He would have called his mother. He would have woken up the next morning, and then the morning after that, and then all the mornings that should have followed. Instead, there is a gravestone. Instead, there is a family that wakes up every morning in a world that permanently lacks the person they love. Instead, there is a 57-year-old man in a prison cell looking at the wall with nothing left but time and the memory of a choice he cannot undo. There is a moment in every confrontation where the road forks. where one path leads toward restraint and wisdom and the recognition that your pride is not worth another human being's life, and where the other path leads here, to a parking lot in Key West, to a young man on the ground, to a lifetime behind bars, to a community left asking how something so catastrophic could have started with something so small. If you are watching this and you live in a state where you have the legal right to carry a firearm, this case is worth thinking about, not as an argument against that right, but as a reminder of what that right demands of the person who exercises it. Restraint, proportionality, the honest, unflinching acknowledgement that a gun changes every situation it enters, that the decision to initiate a confrontation while armed, it is never a neutral decision, and that on the other side of every split-second choice is a person with a name, a person who makes their mother laugh, a person who still has things they are looking forward to. Garrett Hughes had things he was looking forward to. He never got to them. His name was Garrett Hughes. He was 21 years old. He deserved to grow old. And he deserved to be remembered as exactly what he was. Not a victim, not a cautionary tale, not a statistic, but a person. A full, complicated, irreplaceable human being who was taken from the people who loved him on a Friday night in a parking lot in Key West, Florida, for nothing.